Black people don't swim. Why do you do white people things? The danger of a single story, as Chimamanda Ngozi so beautifully says. I grew up in Soweto, in this landlocked area that's about 6 hours from the nearest ocean. Where I grew up, we grew up around these stories about what lives beneath the surface of the water. We were told about these snakes that live there, and every single time there was a drowning near the river at my grandmother's house, these stories would be reaffirmed. The body didn't come back. Of course the snake had taken them. When people drowned in waves, they were taken by snakes. And later I heard a story that said the bottom of the ocean was an ancestral space, a place where we had no business being. All these stories came home to me to say we had no business being near any body of water. And so I'll never forget the first time I saw the sea for the first time. I was 12 years old, and I'll never forget the moment. It was charged, it was energetic, but inside of my body, there were these stories. But in front of me, there were people splashing in the shallows. There was joy, there was laughter. And so my sister and I ran into the water, and we're having the time of our lives. But when the water was at your ankle, you're doing great. You're having the time of your life. When the water was at your knees, you'd be pulled out the water because what do you think you're doing? And it's taken me growing up to realize that when you come from a family that doesn't swim, the story only ends one way. And so you're probably wondering, how does this girl from Soweto go on to become the Black Mermaid? I'd love to tell you. In 2016, I find myself in these beautiful Gili Islands in Indonesia, and I go on my first ever snorkel trip. I'm 28 years old. I had no idea how to use a mask. I had no idea how to use a snorkel. I'm not going to bore you with the details of jumping into the water and freaking out. I want to take you to the moment that followed, self to self. And so I follow the group, and I just remember thinking, these blues are so blue, and the colors were so radiant, and I'll never forget these yellow fish that would come past, and you're like, what's going on? And I looked down, and in comes one of the most incredible lives that I've ever gotten to witness, this moray eel, a honeycomb moray eel. She was yellow with black spots on her. For the first time, I saw something that looked like me. And a lot of people don't understand what that means, but let me be. And so in this moment again, the coral is lit up. It looks like it's lit up from beneath, but that's because the sun is shining on it so beautifully. First part of the snorkel trip. Second part of the snorkel trip, our dive master keeps diving down, and he's coming up with these shells, and they're shiny, and I'm just like, where did you find those? Who's shining the shells? What's going on? And between these questions, I dive in behind him. And I must have held my breath for maybe 15 to 20 seconds. And the most incredible feeling landed in my body. A feeling of being home, a feeling of belonging. And so I come back into South Africa, I start scuba diving, go on this incredible journey, and a little bit later, I find freediving. In 2020, I go on to qualify as a freediving instructor, going on to become South Africa's first Black female freediving instructor. And so this had been such an incredible journey. I'd witnessed so many beautiful worlds. But the topic of conservation had not arrived for me. Conservation, ocean conservation, was a white people thing. It belonged over there with them. It felt elitist. It felt like you needed money in order to be able to participate in this conservation work. And over the years, while diving, I started diving with sharks. And every time you'd see these sharks, they'd have these hooks, these fishing hooks on the side of their mouths. And it would be just digging into their skin. A little bit later, you see these Cape Fur seals, and they're stuck in fishing line, and they can't swim. A little bit later, you're seeing a bit more plastic on your dives, and in the coral and between the coral beds, microplastic. And the part that just broke me, one of the most beautiful coral reefs I know, in the world, I saw about a coin size of coral bleaching. This beautiful coral bed was in Sodwana Bay, right here in our home. I knew I had to do something. I knew I'd need to start speaking. I needed to tell stories. And that brought me back to the most beautiful place I know, my grandmother's table, the very first storyteller that I ever got to know. My grandmother told the most amazing stories, but the story that remains with me to this day was her saying, "We've always lived with nature. We've never been apart from her. She tends to us, we tend to her. Nature doesn't come before us, we don't come before her. We live together." And I remember thinking, okay, so how do I tell the story of this big, beautiful world that I live in? How do I bring back that love? How do I bring it back to my community where I feel like we are so disconnected from nature? And, well, incredible things began to happen. I started diving with sharks, and it was incredible because from diving with great white sharks to tiger sharks to bull sharks, these massive sharks was a moment when you realize how big they are and how powerful they are, and yet they let us be there with them. But also for me, it was realizing how these sharks are important to our oceans. They are key species in keeping the ecosystem healthy in our oceans. These apex predators are near extinction from fishing practices, but also from delicacies from across the world. How do we protect these beautiful sharks? We need them in our waters. I started swimming with whales all across the world, and it was absolutely incredible to witness these 10, 15-meter incredible beings, 10, 20 tons, come up from the bottom of the ocean, and they just miss you, and you're this tiny. And they come up and they look at you. It was the most incredible world, but also these whales, once again, key important beings when we talk about these beautiful oceans, from the plankton that they eat to when they poo. They are these incredible fertilizers of our ocean. They bring up the nutrients from deep down in these deep oceans, and they bring it up to the surface, and they fertilize the entire ocean all across the world. These beings. And then these coral reefs that are so colorful and so full of life. And to me, I couldn't believe the colors that exist in the water. And I still think the world looks for inspiration in the ocean because some of the most incredible worlds and colors live there. And these coral reefs might protect us on the coast, but they're also home to some of the most incredible fish life species, and little shrimps, and little mantis shrimps, and small microscopic organisms that keep our oceans diverse. And so this, for me, was an incredible moment of saying, I need to keep telling these stories. But we also needed to speak about the systemic. That's important, because how do these narratives that are from so long ago continue to not only live, but thrive? And so for me, I looked at 4 things. South Africa may be free today, but her spatial planning hasn't changed since the apartheid government. And all that means is that the less desirable beaches that have strong rip currents and that have massive rocks and that are hard to explore in remain in black and brown communities the most. And the beaches that would have been white-only beaches back in the day are still a journey away to get to them, the place where you can explore and snorkel and enjoy. That matters. 2, when we talk about this incredible ocean and her bounty, in my community, I would come back and I'd say, well, we need to protect our oceans, and everybody says, why? For who? It's clearly not for us. And so it lends itself to the first point of saying, who benefits from the ocean's health? Who benefits the most from her bounty? And in South Africa, it's still largely in white communities. And so it's hard to look at this ocean and think about her protection when you're still thinking about survival. And the blue ocean economy, yes, it is open, and yes, it is calling to people to say there's these opportunities that are available. But the question is, are they accessible? 3rd, representation. I believe in it with all of my heart. How do you dream about a world that you've never seen before? How do you dream about becoming an ocean explorer? How do you dream about becoming a marine biologist if it's something that you've never, ever come across in your life? And so I started this foundation called the Black Mermaid Foundation. And our work is to create access to this ocean space, but to also create resources that facilitate that first sight underwater. We work with kids that are between 10 and 15 years old, because you can be 28 years old when you see the beneath the surface for the first time, but what would happen if that stage was way earlier? We've had the incredible opportunity to take out over 400 kids, facilitating that moment, facilitating that love, building that connection. We've partnered with organizations in Sao Tome, Seychelles, Madagascar, Rhode Island, and that world is growing. But for me, it says we need to expand the narrative around these oceans. We need to create the invitation. We need to keep telling these stories. And last, fear. Oh my word, fear. The fear of these big, wild waters that are so deep. The fear that says these waters have seen so much of our pain. And boy, do our bodies know it. I dream about black joy in the water. I dream about the ocean witnessing our joy. And so the story of working with our fear. And with that, I'd like to tell you a story. On my journey to becoming a freediving instructor, I was stuck at 23 meters for the longest time. And all that is, it's not because my breath hold was not long enough. I was afraid. I was afraid because of the stories that live in my body about what lives in the bottom of the ocean. I was afraid about having this only one breath. And if I see anything that frightens me, will I have enough breath to surface before I swallow the ocean? I was afraid of dying. And so it was this incredible journey of finding my fear and walking with her. And in this journey was the most beautiful gift I could have ever imagined. The gift of being present. Oh my word. And the deeper I went into the ocean and I felt this presence, I would get down to 35 meters and the first feeling was like I had shed this body and I had become absolutely everything. Everything that has lived before, everything that lives right now. I was everything. And so the work of finding and journeying with my fear changed my life. I can never speak about the ocean being an ancestral place, but I can tell you that it is sacred. It is where I go. It is where I go over and over again. For wisdom, for healing, for expansion, and to remember that I'm not only this body. And so, how do we replicate these stories? How do we get to this beautiful place that says we can do this over and over again? These worlds are ours too. Well, one, we start by creating access to these ocean spaces in a way that allows people to build a connection, to know that these waters belong to them too. Because that's how we protect anything. We have to believe that it belongs to us too. If you look at, again, proximity doesn't equate to access. And so how are we going to bridge that gap? But also, if we're going to change the trajectory that our oceans find themselves in, we need all hands on deck. And two, we need to build these ocean literacy programs that get to schools and that get to communities and that get to strengthen our advocacy, that allows youth to be able to stand up and partner, not only with business, but government in the policies that we allow in our time, on our watch. And, I believe in starting the little ones at a young age. I wrote a beautiful book called Zandi's Song. And Zandi's Song is, again, educating about the problem of plastic that we have in this world. 3, we would need to keep on telling these stories over and over and over again. We need to create that invitation because I feel like the ocean is always an invitation for us to remember where we come from. And so it's, to tell these stories is important for me. Denzel Washington speaks about nuance. He speaks about the Sunday morning in a black home and how you can't replicate it just. You must have lived it. And so that's why I moved into filmmaking, because I was frustrated about these ocean conservation films that started somewhere that did not speak to where I come from. The power of nuance, the power of story. And last, swimming. Swimming must become a basic skill because water is the universal equalizer. And so, why do I show up to these conversations? When it comes to ocean conservation, I say, well, we need to build access, but also we need to show up intentionally to undo what the old government did. That's 1. And 2, I show up to these conversations about climate change because I know that as Africans and her people, we are the least contributors to where we find ourselves today when it comes to these oceans and this climate. But at the same time, I know that we stand to be affected the most from these effects. I look at these oceans and I think about how these extreme weather patterns are going to get worse and worse. Rising ocean temperatures are a problem because it's not only the coastal erosion that will happen, but it means more floods, more droughts. I show up to these conversations about the ocean because as much as I love her marine life, I care about species diversity. Because if we're going to have healthy oceans, we need that diversity. 3 billion people look to the ocean for sustenance. When we show up for these oceans, we don't just show up for us and our families, we show up for humanity. And so SDG 14, life below water, we might as well call it life above water, because there is no thriving humanity without thriving oceans. As I get to my close, it's interesting because I thought we would take a nice big breath. I changed my mind. Let's hold our breath, at least for 15 seconds. How's that for an ocean gift? I thank you.